You've spoken a bit about Byzantine art, and I think when people think of sacred art, if they think of it at all in their day-to-day
I
lives,
think of
is
Leonardo.
they probably, yes, particularly on the Latin Western side, they think of Leonardo, and but otherwise, if they were trying to think of art, more widespread art, I suppose what's really come to the fore now, what's quite interesting, is you find Catholic and Anglican churches bringing Byzantine
Yeah,
iconography
yeah.
into the church, and it almost feels like that's a tacit admission, a realization that something's been lost along the way. What are, and I know we've spoken a bit about definitions about what's iconic and
Mm.
iconographic. What are the iconic bits of sacred art that ultimately is represent the Western Church? Is it Leonardo's Last Supper? Is it
Okay, Leonardo's Last Supper is interesting because, first of all, it's a fresco. So it doesn't have the extreme depths of contrasts in dark and light, what we call values in the art world. So values really means the differences between the highlights. You can see the highlights on my face here, and the shadows on this side, and a little reflected light back here. That's all values. If you were doing a portrait of me right now, you would be concerned about where the dark line, the shadow starts here, and where it stops here, and so I'm looking at myself in the camera. But so that's values. It's actually more important than color. It's almost more important than composition. You can't have composition without values. So one of the big differences stylistically between the Renaissance and the late Gothic, right? So there was this continuity in sacred art that started with the late imperial times, the late antiquity. In the starting around the 5th century, you started seeing what we now refer to as Byzantine art, which is actually based on, believe it or not, Roman realism. And it slowly developed for theological reasons into something very, very abstracted and very symbolic for specific theological reasons, because the theologians at the time understood sacred artists and theology were like this. Theology was much more important than technique. So a sacred artist had to understand that what he was trying to do was depict transcendent, non-material realities in a material way, with paint on a board or on a fresco on a plastered wall. So it presented a conundrum, a difficulty, which we've been struggling with ever since. So what the Byzantine world did was develop a very specific visual vocabulary, a very specific visual language that everyone understood. Everyone spoke it, in a sense. They would look at an icon and they would know what they're looking at, not just be able to identify the figures or the scene being depicted, like the nativity or these sort of biblical scenes or persons. So we know about hagiography. So we see a woman in a robe standing next to a broken wheel. We know that's St. Catherine of Alexandria. So we can kind of recognize some of the symbols. But a Byzantine person of the 7th or 8th century, who was an iconodule, person who loved icons, who was on the side of goodness, righteousness, and the angels in the iconoclastic controversy, would be able to look at an icon and understand it to be a kind of conduit. Right? We think of it as a painting as an imaginary window into the past. So that's what Leonardo was doing, and what all those guys were doing, was to try to create a window into the past where you could sort of look down a tunnel and see something that was going on long time ago to people who are long gone and with whom you have no personal connection at all. You're just being presented with a figure from the past. Now, an icon, because it's abstracted, because it has this very specific abstract language of symbols, the icon kind of takes away that distance and brings the person represented into the room with you. So it creates a kind of meeting point between heaven and divine transcendent realities and us, normal people. And there's a bunch of tricks that depicting. Byzantine art does, like the reverse perspective. So we think of a painting as having, the vanishing point goes this way, and you have depth into the room, and all the lines kind of point towards a vanishing point, and it creates this illusion of depth, and it makes you think that you're seeing something in normal earthly perspective. Byzantine perspective, people say, oh, the Byzantines, they didn't know how to do that. They didn't know how to do naturalistic faces. This is not true. This is not true. They started with all of that naturalism and developed this iconographic, stylized, symbolic style instead, specifically in order to take away naturalism. Because naturalism really effectively separates you from the people being depicted. Now, if you had that iconographic language, if you were fluent in that language, you would be in a room with this, the original of this 6th century Pantocrator. You would understand yourself to be in the room with Christ. That not just that you are being sort of transported to heaven in your imagination, but that heaven is being brought into the room with you through this icon that's been blessed. And it's been blessed not just by, a bishop doing this and some holy water, but by people venerating it. And that's what veneration means. It's acknowledging the presence of the person depicted.
The Orthodox Church services, if you go to those, you can see the veneration of icons in the church.
Yeah, there's a bunch of physical things that you do to venerate an icon. But really, veneration isn't just bowing and making the sign of the cross and kissing the icon and doing all those things. It's an interior knowledge that when you're in a church, and in the old days, before we had all these problems, churches would be covered from top to bottom, from floor to ceiling, and all over every surface would be covered in icons, frescoed paintings and mosaics. So you walked into a church and you were in a different kind of place. This is no longer just a material place. Obviously, everybody knows it's a building made of stone covered in paint. But it's more than that. It allows you to walk into what we might call now a liminal space, a kind of in the Celtic sense, a kind of thin place where the distance between material reality and transcendent reality is erased. You're there, they're with you. Right?
I don't think people get just how colourful these churches and cathedrals were. I certainly didn't. It took me a long time to figure it out. And when you try and get your head around, particularly in Britain, you go to the English cathedrals and there's always an austere feeling because it's sandstone all the way up, right?
The just shaved them all off. The churches in Britain until then were actually famous for their wall paintings. They weren't very sophisticated because they were a little bit of an outpost in the middle of nowhere from the centers. When Constantine took it into his head to move the capital of the empire to Byzantium, he took all the best artists with him. So leaving the West with really inferior resources. And so Britain...
The outside of the buildings were as painted as well, weren't they?
They were.
In many cases.
Yeah, it was... you sometimes see now it's a bit of a fashion for churches to have a laser show that will sort of project the colors onto something like the facade of Chartres or something. And you can really see. The Middle Ages was not a drab period. And that tradition... So we have a continuity between this origins of sacred art with that idea, with the idea of being in the room with this transcendent reality, that the icons made heaven come to you. So we kept that idea going until, the end of the Gothic, when all of a sudden we got this new idea. We got this materialist idea where art was no longer served those spiritual functions. It became You were no longer a person interacting with heaven through the conduit of this icon. You were there to admire the technical skill of this craftsman, and by extension, the discerning taste of the person who commissioned it. You were supposed to admire those things. So we started losing very quickly. What the sort of theological history of it was at the time, I don't really know. But the art definitely had the effect of altering the Western mind away from the Eastern notion of veneration to just sort of admiring a work and not having any kind of interaction with it.